see that basically all the intelligent people are in this room. I believe about half of you are here for Brendan's talk, and the other half for the air conditioning, probably. I can tell you, I'm suddenly very awake.
Bodies in seats is bodies in seats, even if it's just for air conditioning.
You're not here for Brendan's talk now, but when it starts, you will be. I am very happy to be allowed to introduce Brendan because, first of all, he has a pretty impressive resume. He worked at Netflix, then TypeSafe, then MongoDB, now at Bolt Radius, which was then reacquired by TypeSafe, which is now called Lightbend.
Yes.
Yes, so essentially, there's a lot
by
of branching and merging.
I think by the time the sale closed, they were Lightbend. But when
Okay.
they told us they bought us, they were TypeSafe still.
Yeah, so your CV almost looks like a Git repository with all the merges so you're a very prolific speaker, about 4 conference talks a year, and you'll be speaking at MuCon in November. Is that correct?
Yep, as well as I think I'm doing an Akka workshop at the CodeMesh conference right before that, which Bodil is involved in, so I'm sure will go well. And Java Day Kiev next month, if anybody fancies a trip to the Ukraine.
Boom. There you go. This is a professional. In fact, I asked around a little bit to get sort of a feeling beyond the CV. What do people think about Brendan? And I got a lot of very heartwarming replies, such as, and I quote, such a warm spirit, never sarcastic. I have never heard him swear. He's essentially Buddha.
Sure you were talking about Dick Wall.
He's essentially, yeah. That people said that Brendan, he's essentially Buddha with hair, and he recently, this especially rings true because he recently went on a spiritual pilgrimage to a meditative resort, a cabin in the woods, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. He was very happy.
Wi-Fi, it just didn't connect to anything.
Right. So I would like you all to give a very warm and welcoming applause to Brendan McAdams.
Well, thank you. I rarely actually get an introduction, so to get an introduction complete with absolutely lies for quotes is great. Actually, I believe that was entirely examples of people being sarcastic about me not being sarcastic. I will avoid the swearing this time, though, since I am on video and someone will notice. So I am Brendan. I work for Lightbend again. The majority of my career, the last couple of years, has been really as a consultant and a trainer and other things. I was at MongoDB for 2 years doing a lot of the JVM work. And then I went to TypeSafe for a while to do the same thing. Spent a year doing engineering again at Netflix, and I'm kind of back into that. So a lot of what I do is helping other people. And I'm going to use the R word, just fair warning with reactive architecture. Helping people build systems with Scala, with Akka, with other things like Play. I don't always get to write a lot of code myself, but I've been playing a little bit with this idea lately that, full credit, the idea was Thomas Lockney's. Unfortunately, Thomas rarely gets to come to conferences, which is a shame. So I will try not to take credit for all of this. But I want to talk about this. This is an interesting idea, and I think it's representative of something that is emerging. Whether we want it or not, it's sort of built around the concept of serverless architecture. So my operating system is almost booted. And now, because, the internet here, we let the modem dial. I really should have added audio. I try as a habit to not add audio to my talks, but the ringtone on my phone is a 56K modem, so I actually had the audio and I have no excuse. Which brings us to really what we're talking about. The system, it's pronounced Quake, and I'll talk in a second about what that means. But the general idea here is that it is event-driven Scala on AWS, Amazon's Lambda platform, which is relatively new, and especially relatively new for, they call it JavaScript, as we all know, as long as it compiles, it can run on Java as Scala. So this is a serverless microframework for Scala on AWS Lambda. And the idea as well is to make it really easy to do this stuff. So look, you're not going to build your Fortune 500 enterprise necessarily on Lambda, but you're going to maybe find there are certain things that you're trying to do that you can accomplish. One of the things is huge cost reduction, which I'll at least mention in passing. Or if we just want to make it simple, this talk is about AWS Lambda, Scala, and Whiskey. So again, my introduction. If you don't already know my handle, I was lucky enough to be on Twitter long enough to have a 3-letter handle. There is a well-known university in New York which continues to harass me about the fact that I have the handle. So, you know, it's always fun. I can imagine people want those. So what is a Quake? Now, of course, we are in Britain. Hopefully there's a few Scots in the room. A Quake is actually a traditional bowl with 2 handles that one would serve whiskey in. And actually, I read an interesting story when I was looking it up that Sir Walter Scott apparently had one made of wood that after the Battle of Waterloo, he got carved from the elm tree that the Duke of Wellington used as his command post, which is pretty awesome. I mean, Sir Walter Scott had a whole other resume of interesting things, including an ode to a haggis. So it fits very well. So the reason that I called it a Quake, and it is pronounced like Quake, is that we were inspired by something that Amazon released recently called Chalice. And so, of course, it's like, well, if we're going to build something kind of like Chalice, we should have a drink holder name. And to be honest, we originally went with Stein, and it took me a long time to bring Thomas around to the idea of Quake. But I mean, really, the Scala community were whiskey people. There was a talk many years ago that Martin gave at Intel in Santa Clara where one of the important questions was what his favorite whiskey was, which, by the way, was, I believe, Lefroy Quarter Cask. So this was inspirational to us. It was really cool because it really is a simple micro-framework. I did Python a lot. That was almost the gateway for me to Scala. I mean, I did Perl many years ago, but was completely ignorant of the whole functional programming aspect. Now I look back and realize that we had map and flat map and all these other things, and what an idiot I was. But I did, Python was the place where I really started to understand things like, oh, functions are first-class objects, and oh, higher order functions and all of these other things. But one of the things I loved with Python was how rapidly you can develop, because there's a couple really cool lightweight frameworks like Bottle and Flask, where you can write a single-page app. It's really simple. You don't have to have all routes files and all these things that we have with like Play or Ruby on Rails or all these other things. You build something simple, and the code is generated behind the scenes. Now, of course, with a dynamic language, code generated behind the scenes isn't always the greatest thing, but I still have a lot of love for Python. And like I said, I think both of us really liked what we saw and talked about, hey, it would be really cool to do something like this. So I've been honestly only hacking on this the last couple days. A lot of this talk is about where we're going. Most of what I've spent the last 2 days doing is making sure absolutely 100% that everything I want to do is possible. That was my goal yesterday. If you saw me screaming and yelling and giving obscene gestures to my laptop, that was because I was trying to make sure that everything would work. So we had an idea, as I said. I feel like someone should answer, are you pondering what I'm pondering here?
I think so, Brain, but me and Pippi Longstocking, what would the kids look like?
Excellent. Thank you, Dick Wall. I almost knew that Dick was the one who was going to answer. I think Jamie Allen made me take it off, but I recently configured the Slack bot at Lightbend with every single Pinky in the Brain response. And if you said, are you pondering what I'm pondering, it would randomly provide one.
But where are we going to get a rubber chicken and a tutu at this time of night?
There you go. Or, I believe, but where are we going to find lederhosen in my size? Since Oktoberfest is impending, as Roland and I were discussing last night. So as I said, the original name was Stein. Again, hey, a good seg into Oktoberfest. I am a fan of German beer. So as I said, Thomas Lockney and I have been discussing it. He gets a lot of credit for this. It really was his idea. It was a back and forth discussion on Google Hangouts, and it was a really interesting idea, and it kind of, he had to find some time, and I had to find some time. It was an idea I liked, and John kept accepting talks from me, and then like 3 days later saying, oh, we have too many talks about that. Or, most importantly, we have talks from much better people who know more about macros than you do, so talk about something else. So this was ultimately where I got to. Hey, I've got this idea. This is a great excuse to really make some progress on it. So the idea, as I said, Amazon named it after a drinking vessel. We should name ours after a drinking vessel, only a better one. Because what do you put, wine in a chalice? We can't call it Grail because that just references an abomination with Groovy. So first, we need to talk about what AWS Lambda is. I was not that familiar with it. I had heard it bounced around, and I think one of the reasons I ignored it is that it was originally launched with only Node.js support. And I think that Amazon did a poor job of letting people know, by the way, we added support for Python and JDK8. And so, I mean, certainly their docs don't helpfully refer to how to do a lot of the things in Python and JDK8, so I spent a lot of time translating Node in my head. If you saw me hiding in the bathroom sobbing uncontrollably yesterday, that was part of the reason. So the idea, though, and this is what I mentioned as this is something that we are going to start to run into whether we want to or not. And I've seen some great jokes lately about like serverless takes the concept of the cloud as just someone else's computer to an even scarier ending. But it's there, it's happening. And there's big benefits to it. It's a serverless framework. And this is the, sort of the trigger word that I've heard plenty of people are like, please don't use the word serverless around me. But it makes sense. The biggest thing about serverless is instead of having to provision an AWS instance and install Linux or Windows or OpenBSD, because OpenBSD is still awesome, and then pay for this server to keep running, even when maybe our service is idle much of the time, which can ring up costs. I mean, even just running a micro instance can be expensive. We do event-driven programming where Amazon does a lot of work to make sure that we're not being charged unless we are actively responding to a request, which is pretty cool. And you're going to see more and more of this happening where we really get back to the thing. I mean, the cloud helped us reduce the costs of running our own data centers. I don't know how many of you ever had to do that, but in addition to be costly, it was great waiting 3 weeks for HP to build and provision a server for me when I needed more capacity today, as well as racking it and installing it. And going further, how do we further reduce the cost? So as I said, it supports Node.js, Python, JDK8, which of course means as long as I can produce an assembly jar, I can essentially provide Scala support on this. So of course, serverless, and as I said, it seems to be a trigger word for some people. I'm trying to remember, I went looking for the tweets yesterday. There were some absolutely great tweets about serverless that I saw a few months ago, mostly from the DevOps crowd that I felt were apropos. But instead, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means, because believe it or not, there's actually a server hiding under there. We just don't get to configure it. So it's, as I said, even more down the lines of it's just someone else's computer. For all you know, there's some developer at Amazon who's running it on his laptop. So what is serverless? And I mentioned this a little bit, but in a nutshell, it is cloud computing, but we don't provision an instance. And the other piece, which I don't think I managed to mention in my bullet points here, is, as I said, it reduces cost because the concept around a good serverless infrastructure is only charging us when we are actively running things. Now, I haven't dug too deeply into the true cost when it's not running, but since it's on Lightben's AWS account, I'm sure someone will yell at me eventually. But really, I mean, that's a big part of what it is. And when you read the docs, they talk about kind of what they do. So ultimately, there's an event loop running. Amazon provides a sort of base framework. And it looks like, because if you actually look at the source for the jars they provide, they're just interfaces. So I believe they are monkey patching your code into their own framework. But they're running an event loop. That's really, the event is just constantly spinning because we don't want to start the server up every time. And you'll certainly notice the first time you deploy a Lambda app that it takes a little while before it responds, but after that, it's very quick. So we upload a jar. Amazon auto provisions the resources to execute this on. But when things are idle, when we are not responding to requests, they talk in their documentation about essentially suspending that event loop so that we're not doing things. And I actually noticed when I was digging around last night, if you configure logging, logging will show you I responded to this resource, I executed for this long, and the cost was this. So it kind of gives you an idea of exactly how much each request cost you, which is great. Now we know exactly what to bill each individual customer. So events, because this is event-driven, and there's lots of interesting events and things. I was really surprised at what I saw because the first exposure I had to this, which was Chalice, the Python framework that was entirely HTTP. But it turns out really we can write anything. We write and we register. So you tell Lambda, here's my jar file, run this class or this object and this method. And it actually handles a bunch of different method inputs. But ultimately, you're registering a handler function which gets JSON input. So everything is driven technically through JSON input, although it's not hardwired to be JSON input. That is what it's supposed to be. For most of the pre-wired events, it produces JSON. Really, you're getting an input stream which happily JSON4S will accept and quickly parse. And the JSON will differ based upon the source of the event. And of course, that means that one of the things that I'm doing with Quake is instead of going the Chalice route, which is purely HTTP, is, hey, why don't we look at support for all of the different possible events? So Amazon provides a couple of pre-built wiring. One of the cool things is triggers from S3 buckets. So that you can have your Lambda function invoked if a new file is added to an S3 bucket or changed or deleted or updated. So maybe you do something in response to that. There are a bunch of others, but the other big one that seems to be documented is DynamoDB, which is Amazon's sort of Cassandra-like version, although technically Cassandra is based on Amazon's Dynamo paper, so I don't know, the chicken and the egg. Since Dynamo was closed source for a while, I guess it still is. But again, it's almost like database triggers. Changes happen in DynamoDB. You can have it invoke your Lambda function, and it's really easy in the web UI to just click and configure a trigger. And also they have an API gateway. So you can set up an API, and in fact, it even supports uploading a Swagger file, and it will auto-generate everything for you, which, having done a lot of API work at Netflix, I am enamored of Swagger, besides the fact it was originally written in Scala. You can also wire up your own events, though. There's the idea that ultimately, as long as you can have something call your Lambda function, and your Lambda function can handle whatever's being passed in, you can wire your own events. So the possibilities are pretty big. If you have something that doesn't have to constantly be running, but you want to have real code that's maybe not hardwired into some other service. So as I said, our inspiration was Chalice, and I really do love Python. One of the things I really like about Python is decorators. So it was in July, Amazon released this demo called Chalice, and it looks a lot like Bottle or Flask for those of you who've done Python. And it really is single page HTTP handling. I'm going to show a little bit of Python because I want you to get an idea of why I loved, how simple it is. Even if you don't know Python, it's pretty easy to read. And you really just write one .py file with all of your methods and defining the routes. It handles the request routing behind the scenes. The cool thing about Python decorators, they look like an annotation complete with the at before them, but they're actually higher order functions. So it's very easy to write a decorator in Python where it's just really a higher order function that you decorate something with, say, @route, as I'll show you with some arguments. But what it's doing is wrapping the method that you've decorated and automatically adding functionality. One of my favorite things for years was that a developer called Ben Bangert wrote a, what did he call it? Beaker, which was a caching framework for Python. So you could decorate a method and then specify, cache it in memcache, cache it in memory, cache it in MongoDB, although I'm responsible for the MongoDB plugin, sorry. And the whole idea was it would take the parameters passed to the method, take the result, and cache it. So decorators are really easy to work with, and I admit one of the first things I played with in Scala was trying to write a compiler plugin that emulated decorators, but it turns out to be really hard when you never know what the input type in a static language is. So maybe one of these days I'll figure it out. But the idea is you just define your routes. So if we look at the Python very briefly, the imports don't matter. We are defining a hash map that's just cities to state. And then the first method here is just the route slash. If something comes into slash, we're just going to return a map that represents, and of course it'll convert to JSON, that represents hello world. The next one, though, is taking parameters. Now, this is all wired with the API gateway. You have to set up the API gateway to take these paths. But in the braces in the route is a parameter, city. So now, of course, this is dynamic, and in the case of the Chalice situation, it will invoke state of city with that city argument. And we can return something like a map lookup. And there's one more sort of useful thing. You can optionally accept HTTP methods. So they're the ones default to GET. But if we want to take posts or puts, then we can add that as an argument. And there's a context object that's provided that allows you to get to things like the JSON body and everything else. So this is the start of the inspiration of things. Granted, it's not perfect. Chalice uses the API gateway. It's very painful to configure. That was what I was struggling with a lot yesterday. Chalice sort of auto-configures it, and it's pretty painful to do yourself. You basically set up your route, which says when you get a request to this with this method, call the Lambda function. And of course, it lets the Lambda function know via the JSON what's being invoked, what the path is, what the parameters are, the query string, the method, etc. Configuring, as I said, it's done with velocity templates. And I believe a few people said, really, velocity templates? I haven't seen them in a long time, although I did recall IntelliJ still uses them if you define file templates. But velocity apparently is still around, and I guess it's not the worst thing in the world to do. So the idea with the API gateway is actually it passes nothing when you initially invoke it, but you can set up a velocity template with a bunch of predefined variables that Amazon provides and construct a JSON document that will be passed along with the body of any JSON that's also submitted with the request. So I can add in what's the query string, what are the headers, whatever other information from the API call I want. So if it's an API call that requires Amazon authentication, I can find out the ARN or the username or whatever else, but we have to set everything up by hand. Chalice helpfully provides a plugin or an app that, spelling error. I hate when I do that. I'm pretty good with spelling. They provide a built-in deployer that all of this for us configures. We right now are using a pretty basic plugin that Gilt released that is sort of, it does at least the uploading and the deployment of the Lambda, but it doesn't do a lot of the gateway configuration, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But the truth about where we are so far is what's next. So eventually, I haven't decided yet if I'm going to fork the Gilt plugin. I think most likely we will reproduce some of the functionality because there's a lot that we have to add in order to make this really useful. I want this to be stupid simple for people to set up and use this to do these serverless applications. So let me admit where I am so far, which isn't entirely true. I do have a plan. It's a little like Battlestar Galactica. It took us about 5 seasons to find out what the plan was. So come back at Scala World 2021, and I'll tell you what I have in mind. Of course, we can fake it till we make it. And no one who knows me should be surprised. I'm notorious sometimes for writing presentations in entirely 0 to 60 in 5 minutes before a talk. But the reality is I have started hacking, and we've started hacking at this. The biggest thing was that I know what I want to do. What was important was making absolutely sure that the whole Lambda platform would allow me to do what I wanted to do, as well as all the things in Scala like annotations. And I've gotten to that point. I'm absolutely sure that all the things I want to do are possible, and not necessarily difficult, just time consuming. So the code base is still a little inchoate. It's, or nascent, or whatever word you want to use. It's in its infancy. So Chalice only supports HTTP events. The plan for me is eventually, although I'm going to start with HTTP, to support handling any Lambda event, support S3 triggers, support Dynamo triggers, because this could be potentially very useful for building something quick. And I am hoping to release a beta soonish, but let's take a look at where we are heading. And I couldn't sleep last night, so I actually made a lot more progress, but I was coding in my pajamas. So where the HTTP support is now, this is a rough mock-up. Some of this code works, some of it's not quite there, but as a rough idea, a lot of this is going to change right now. It's very close to how Chalice does things. So there are base traits for whatever else. Ultimately, you would tell Lambda that the function to invoke is demo HTTP server : and then there's a handle function in the HTTP app, and that takes care of parsing the JSON, making sure that it has the fields that it needs to have, generating a case class to represent the context object and the request object, and then there's some stuff to pull out the JSON body and everything else. So here is that simple route. An index, we don't really do anything with it, we just return hello world. We get a little more interesting, of course, when we have parameters. And again, I've gone close to, and this is how you have to define parameters in the API gateway. They've got to be in braces. So the handling of parameters here is not ideal. I'm just, I'm thinking that my annotation or whatever, will expand out into being able to automatically pass to the method. Ultimately, of course, everything we get on HTTP we have to treat as a string, but a lot of frameworks, like if you look at Play's got some nice stuff in routing that lets you say regex or something else to make sure that it's a type, and that's where I'd like to get eventually, is to have some type validation, to say, look, this absolutely has to be a string or return to them a bad request. The idea here is I'm just taking the username, I'm doing a fake user lookup, and either returning an error or returning some JSON. So the annotation will pull them out as strings, and I would like to be able to declare types in the route definition, have appropriate error handling, essentially behind the scenes. Minimize as much as possible of what I have to write, because the whole point of this is quick development. And then finally looking at the idea of, okay, well, how do I handle posts or puts? And I've put that together. This is roughly what I'm thinking. It may end up being something with the annotation changing a little bit, but the request object actually stores the posted JSON body. I'm using JSON for S right now. So what you can do if you look is I just do request.body to a .extract and I give it a case class. And the whole idea is it will just pull out that case class, represent everything appropriately. I'm using JSON for S right now. I know there are 64,000 JSON APIs for Scala and another 100 for Java, and everyone has their own preference. JSON for S can be great, but I'd ultimately would like it to be pluggable, because otherwise I'm just going to have endless GitHub issues. Why don't you support Cersei? Why don't you support John, etc.? And they will be pluggable. But the API gateway does have some really cool functionality as well. You can define JSON schemas that validate not only requests, to say that requests must meet this JSON schema to be valid, or the API gateway saves you from even invoking your function and therefore not really costing you anything, as well as valid responses. And that's something that is very interesting with the idea of, hey, we can auto-generate stuff at compile time, which includes producing, hey, if we use this case class for a valid request, why can't we provide that to the API gateway configuration? So the route annotation is meant to, of course, we are compile time. Decorators are runtime, the downside of dynamic language, as much as I love Python. But the idea is that they will build a routing table, so that when the function is involved, it can look at this routing table that's been generated and figure out, based on the request path and method, which method to call. There's still some debate. I'm giving some thought, and I've been talking to Rory and Sam about the benefits of a compiler plugin versus an annotation. I think one of the things in the car this morning was that if we're producing side effects, a compiler plugin might be a little more friendly. But ultimately, with both, it's something that happens at compile time. So I want to generate all of these things. I want to generate the Scala code for the routes, but I also want to spit out the metadata, all the things that I need to configure the API gateway so that I don't have to do it by hand, so that we configure Lambda, the API gateway, the S3 buckets for uploading the jar file to, the permissions that are appropriate, because if you've used AWS, permissions are insanity. You have to configure them all over the place, and then you try to do something and it gives you an obscure error, and then you try 3 more things, and then you spend 6 days on Stack Overflow and eventually get there. So of course, if we can figure that out now, make that work, that is ideal. So as well as the JSON schemas. I mean, if I'm going to have case classes as the thing that is driving what people are using as their input, well, there's no reason I can't take that case class and generate a rough JSON schema from it that we can produce into the API gateway. So, of course, I'm patting myself on the back here. It's really just an excuse to sneak My Little Pony into my talk. So one of the other things here, and I mentioned that we're using the Gilt SBT plugin And actually, I've noticed it has contributions from Dick Wall, from Gary Cody, and I believe he just joined Lightbend, but I'm terrible at pronouncing his name, Dale Wijnand, however it is. Sorry, Dale, if you're in the room or not in the room. I'm messing up your name, but thank you to all of you because it gave me a good starting point and made me able to do what I wanted to do. So as I said, I'm leveraging this. This is a Gilt/SBT AWS Lambda on GitHub. It's a good start. It will create your Lambda function, so it will set that up through the AWS API. It will set up a role that has permission to execute things. It will create an S3 bucket and upload your jar into that to configure the Lambda function and a couple of other things. But doing the rest, the things that were hard, the things that I had to figure out, that I would hope if I provide something to make this easy for people, was things like provisioning the API gateways, setting up the JSON schemas, all of the other things that by hand are very painful. And if any of you noticed me at all yesterday, including right before dinner was served, this may or may not look familiar. We've all been there once or twice. It helps to have universal health care when you do this to yourself while coding, though, certainly. So there is a road to, I want to improve these things, because if it was hard for me, it's going to be hard for other people, and it's not going to be very useful for them to use this. I mean, Amazon's Chalice system does all of this automatically. So one of the cool things is that I found yesterday on the AWS APIs, an S3 upload API that can provide a progress bar. That was one of the things that was confusing me with the plugin yesterday, is it would just sort of say, generated assembly jar, and then it would hang there. And of course, it's hanging there because it's uploading to AWS on the slow conference connection or the satellite at our cottage. And it's hard to tell what's going on. So I want to throw a progress bar in there. But I want to make this excel for rapid development. So I'm thinking about, as I said, provisioning the API gateway automatically with the routes. There's no reason if we're using macros or compiler plugins to pull this information out and generate it when we compile our code and then just have the plugin drive it. Because what we need is more plugins for SBT to make things more confusing, right? And we would generate these by our annotation processors. And most importantly, making it easy. And I think a lot of the base is there in the existing Lambda function. Like I said, I'm debating fork versus sort of recreate. I guess it depends on how willing the current maintainers are to accept input from me. So there is one last idea that I have in mind. Due to our current lodging locality, which actually requires us to commute from San Francisco every morning, it's been great. Okay, not really. We're just very far into the Lake District, and I shouldn't tease John. I mean, he has done a great job putting together the conference, making sure the speakers had lodging. It's been an incredibly stressful. It is utterly difficult to put a conference together, especially by yourself, and I know he's had other help and everything else. So thank you to John, as much as we joke with him, for putting us up somewhere.
But don't accept rights from him.
Okay. Yes. As Bodil showed yesterday, the van, I mean, we all grow up in America knowing not to get into a unpainted white van, especially if they're offering us candy. But we also have satellite internet. It makes the Scala compiler look unbelievably fast. In fact, I was just sitting at the lunch table. We were all trying to come up with a good comparison to, what in contrast the satellite Wi-Fi does. We've just had issues with the satellite going down every time we try to use it. So that's been fun. But this actually inspired something for me, and I've run into this a lot. And actually, I usually fly United. United has actually finally now on all of their non-little regional jets deployed a full satellite Wi-Fi internet. It usually works pretty well. It's surprising. It's only about $15. But still, I mean, it's a little difficult. They block a lot of things, and we spend time on airplanes. Well, I think Git was one of the best things ever because all of a sudden I can check code in while I'm on a plane. But also being offline, whether I'm on vacation, I forgot to pay my cable bill, whatever it is, having the ability to work with Lambda offline is kind of interesting. And I thought about an offline simulator, and I went Googling around and actually found one. So there is a simulator for not just the Lambda API, but the API gateway, which is the other piece of what I'm doing, that someone wrote for the Node.js system. That could be kind of cool. That could be useful. So I couldn't sleep last night. I did a little bit of work prototyping this and starting to play with it. I mean, there's no reason. It's not like it's difficult to generate fake JSON and everything else. So, ultimately that we're not constantly, especially paying to keep uploading things to Amazon until we're sure that they work. So I am hoping to make a useful version that comes out with the first beta. And that's it. They didn't let me have a microphone, and I wouldn't have ruined the poor microphone because they probably would have billed John, but any questions? Yes.
It's true that AWS Lambda supports the JVM languages, but if you read the documentation in terms of costs, they discourage the use of JVM because basically you pay exactly what you use. So the JVM start time might cost you a little bit. Do you think this is actually going to impact on the cost? Do you know if they are planning to resolve this problem? Because actually the Scala code is not exactly fast.
Well, it's faster than compiling it.
Start time it takes a little bit to start.
Yeah, the first start. So I noticed that yesterday. But after the first start, it seems to be okay. It seems to respond pretty quickly. Because my understanding is, they're ultimately starting it up and keeping it running. They just sort of freeze the event loop to not use resources. I don't know. My hope, they launched this originally with Node. They've added Python. They've added the Java support. I think this is going to grow. I hear more and more about it lately, and I can't see a reason why Amazon's not going to necessarily improve that. I think you're going to see people leveraging it. People are going to give feedback to Amazon, but I can't predict the future. For all I know, they're going to, completely change the way things work, but I'm hopeful because I really like the idea for small services of what I can accomplish with this.
But you can still use Scala.js.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose. And I know one of the other things they do say, you can call any of the AWS services like DynamoDB or whatever and trigger things, and you certainly could use Scala.js, which is way better than writing JavaScript by hand. Question in the back?
How do you deal with error handling? I basically did something quite similar to this last week, and I found that getting a REST API that produced decent return codes is a major pain with the API gateway.
I did notice that, and I haven't gotten there yet. It did not seem, you can kind of return JSON or basic JVM types, and it is something I'd like to see. So I may even try to provide feedback to Amazon if it would be great to have a ability to provide return codes, because honestly, you ultimately have the choice between 200 OK or 500. They seem to encourage you to throw exceptions if something goes wrong.
Yeah, the text of the exception and then do some tab invention on that regular expressions and then produce a code with problem.
Yeah. No, it's not great, and that I will admittedly say is a limitation. All I can be is hopeful that someone at Amazon will take pity on us and make their product a little better. I think part of it is, I think the API gateway is relatively new, and so originally it seems like Lambda was built more around the other triggers, and I think they still have some work to do to get better HTTP integration. Yeah, yes.
Do you have any idea how it will play with dependencies and third-party libraries kind of thing?
That's a good question. I suppose it depends. I don't know if they restrict execution or whatever else. I would hope that as long as we have something that's compiled, that it should execute on the JVM. But I'm certain that ultimately we will run into things that don't work. But I don't know what. They specifically, the drop-down doesn't just say Java. It specifically says Java 8. So I'm hopeful that at least we're, as long as it's something that runs. My expectation is they are probably just spinning up a Linux server in the background and running it on there. So anything that we do, but I suppose we can't really interact with the file system or other things. There's probably a lot of restrictions. They may even have sandboxed the JVM. So that'll be something to discover down the road.
What was the question, Brandon? About
Whether there's potential problems with dependencies, I think was what you had asked.
Yeah, kind of like how it would work. So if you wanted to use third-party libraries and various things in your Lambda code, would that kind of, does it play nicely that it just all sort of packages everything up and just sort of happy to...
Yeah.
Yeah,
So is
I found that it does actually. We've even been able, we did quite a lot, which is why I contributed to the Guild plugin. We were even able to get native code running under JNI on there, which surprised me. I didn't think we'd be able to do that, but it worked just fine. And you actually do have access to the file system, but there's no guarantee that between Lambda calls it will be retained because it could be swapped out to another machine or anything like that can happen to it.
So Dick also subtly reminded me of, in Dick's way, that I am being recorded and the audio is coming through a microphone that may not be able to hear the questions, and I should have been repeating the questions. So ultimately the question really was, I think, the packaging and inclusion of third-party libraries rather than how they interact. And Dick has provided some feedback as well that they've worked with it. He's actually gotten JNI working, although I don't know how much I would rely on that. There's some limited file system access, but like anything, it's probably an ephemeral instance, and you probably should be careful about that. But ultimately it's using an assembly jar. So as long as you can pack it up in an assembly jar, and I may at some point choose to throw an extra plugin to native packager or something that just does it there to simplify the config. Right now you kind of have to set up the assembly jar config yourself. Yes?
You said there was a simulator. Does that mean that, does that give me the capability to run it locally? If I want to test it in a local test environment or run it behind a firewall at lower scale, can I do that, or is it just mocking around the edges or something?
So the question was about the simulator, whether you can use it behind the firewall, you can use it for local testing or whatever else. That is the idea. So unfortunately the simulator I found is purely for the Node.js setup, and I want to create one similar for Scala. But my thought around it is that that's exactly what I want to be able to do, is not have to go through uploading and configuring everything, simulating the API gateway, simulating the Lambda execution, because really you're just calling a function and passing it JSON. It's not anything complicated technically to simulate. And maybe even eventually adding support for things like S3 triggers, custom triggers, everything else, because it's always better. And I mean, we could do functional testing and integration testing. Ultimately, right now it's encouraging you to debug in production, which is always awesome. So I'm hoping that with a good simulator that we can encourage, hey, maybe a Scala test plugin, something to make it easy to test these things out. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much for your time, and hopefully this has been interesting, and I will see you all throughout the rest of the day. Thank you.